I want to welcome everyone to our December Learning Community event. Again, my name is Sarah Paterka. I'm the Director of Opportunity St. Paul and Community Engagement at Interfaith Action. I've been with Interfaith for about 2.5 years and have enjoyed this one part of COVID pivot of doing learning events every month via Zoom with a great number of folks learning together from different people throughout our community. Tonight was no exception. We have amazing panel of speakers that you'll hear from tonight that we are excited for you to learn from. So with that said, again, we just ask that you use that chat box to chat and ask questions. Feel free to introduce yourself, leave yourselves on mute, and we're going to get started here. I am going to pass it off to my executive director, Randy Ross, to help kick off our evening. And I know you're out there somewhere, Randy, in Zoom land.
Here I am, Sarah, even unmuted. Welcome, everyone. It's really great to see you. I wish I could greet each one of you individually. Welcome to a wonderful learning evening tonight. We're going to learn background to a really important set of issues, and then we're going to learn what we can do to help. My hope is that by the end of the evening, many of you will decide to sign up for the training that Brenda Burnside is offering beginning on January 5th, and you'll have a chance to meet Brenda in this program. But at this moment, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Ramsey County Attorney John Choi. John Choi was sworn in as the first Korean American chief prosecutor in the United States in 2011. Since taking office, John has become a state and national leader in progressive justice reform, working with public officials and impacted communities to reimagine justice and the role of prosecutors. John's innovative approach to holding abusers accountable while working collaboratively with advocacy agencies to help victims has transformed the way government intervenes in domestic violence and sex trafficking in Minnesota. John is now determined to do the same for victims of sexual assault. In addition, John has been a champion of raising boys and engaging men to prevent violence against women and girls. He has successfully advanced legislation to reunite families when it's in the foster children's best interests. He has developed the use of lethality assessments and GPS technology to keep domestic violence victims safe. And he has increased second chances by diverting people or creating alternative pathways like restorative justice circles before they are charged. John has successfully advocated to reform state drug laws and reinvest savings in community-based solutions and has established a veterans court. John serves on the boards of the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault and Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, and is past president of the Minnesota County Attorneys Association and past trustee of the Women's Foundation of Minnesota. John received the 2015 Minnesota County Attorneys Association Award of Excellence for his innovative leadership in better prosecuting sex traffickers and helping trafficked children. Previously, John served as St. Paul City Attorney from 2006 to 2010 and spent a decade in private practice. John holds a bachelor's degree in psychology from Marquette University and a JD from Hamlin University School of Law, and was a Humphrey Fellow at the University of Minnesota. John, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Well, Randy, thank you so much for that, really kind and generous. And it was way too long of an introduction. I get all kind of embarrassed when we're talking about all those things. But, I want to thank you and everybody on this call for showing up here tonight to have this really important conversation, to hear from some speakers and to think about the possibility of getting more involved in restorative justice, because the way that I see it, as the chief prosecutor is that if we want to improve the quality of justice, the most important thing that we can do in our community is to hand over a lot of what happens in the justice system back to our community where it belongs. I'm a big believer that we will have a better police department when more civilians and people like you are engaged in how we train officers, how we use of force. We will have a better prosecution office and a better court system when all of you are engaged in caring about what happens in our justice system and are involved in some of the actual resolutions and things of that sort. And I believe that restorative justice through a community perspective is the way to work on that. In Ramsey County, we've decreased our use of prison by 47% over the past decade. We've reduced our reliance on jails. We have less kids in detention. We used to have like 150 kids in detention at any one moment. Today we have about 20 to 25 kids on any single day. So we've made a lot of progress, but there's a lot more that needs to be done in the name of race equity, in the name of improved outcomes for everybody in our community. And I believe that the path to get there actually is right in front of me on this call, to get more and more members of our community recognizing that they have a place and they have something that they can offer to help the justice system create some better form of justice than what happens than today. Because today we have this one size fits all justice system. None of us that work in the justice system came to work and concocted this. This was actually concocted at the very origins of the founding of this country. And we believe that somehow through an adversarial trial, we get to the truth, we'll get to safety, we'll get to justice. But the truth is that only a small portion, 2% of our cases actually go to trial. Most everything else is done through plea bargaining resolution. And it's become like this assembly line, all working towards some form of a conviction, some sort of a sanction, a punishment. And then, by the way, these punishments they last forever, because if you have a felony conviction, it's going to haunt you for the rest of your life. And we're doing a lot of work around expungements and post-conviction justice to help people. We're working on a resentencing project where we're going to look at old cases to see if we can resentence people if they're doing well in prison. But your work tonight, getting connected to restorative justice, I want to take all of you and bring you into the work that we do and actually share that power with all of you. So as we think about a case that should be diverted, I would like to send it to restorative justice, and the community knows better than me what we should do. And then you tell me what we should do. But let's not be stuck with like putting it into the assembly line system. I know that the quality of justice can be better if our community comes up with a solution. As we think about plea negotiations, like the Christopher Columbus statute case that we just resolved recently, it made people very happy or very angry. But at the end of the day, we listened to our community. And we had disparate people from various perspectives come together, and they helped inform us in terms of what we should do. And I think at the end of the day, that was the right thing. We could also think about like what type of punishment someone should have, and maybe in a violent crime. But we should be listening to our community to help be a part of that. And I think restorative justice and creating circles, community-based circles, people who actually live in the neighborhoods, people all like you who live in Ramsey County, can be an important part of this type of work. So I just want to thank all of you for coming here to be a part of that, or considering to be a part of that. And hopefully you'll be trained by Brenda Burnside at some point and become connected to the work that we do. And I know that the more of you getting involved is going to make our justice system a lot better. And it's our way to, I think, transform our justice system. So thank you. Thanks for having me. I know I can't stay for the entire meeting, but I'm going to try to stay as long as I can. I just have a 7:30 Zoom call. I've been Zooming all over the country. Actually, I was with people from Manhattan the previous hour and talking with them for about an hour. There's a Manhattan district attorney's race going on there. And then I've got a baseball coaches Zoom meeting at about 7:30. So thanks for having me.
Attorney Choi, we thank you for giving us your 5 minutes and your passion behind this partnership. It was a conversation you led with our civic engagement and faith leaders in March, right before the lockdown, that started this partnership, and we're excited to see it grow and continue. And so we thank you for that. And we know that with your passion and Brenda's passion and Randy's passion, we'll get you volunteers, and we'll be growing this program as we need it. So thank you. Next up, it is my privilege and honor to introduce one of Interfaith Action's board members, Dr. Uhuru Williams, who has been our principal teacher and educator for learning community events this year. Dr. Williams, will you please introduce our speaker for the evening?
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate it. In addition to our speaker, I'm happy to acknowledge tonight a couple of other faculty from University of St. Thomas who are on the call. Dr. Tanya Gladney, who's head of our police leadership program, and also Dr. Jessica Hodge, who's faculty director of the Center for the Common Good, an outstanding organization at the university that's going to be, we hope in the near future, doing some great work with Interfaith Action and our programs. But tonight, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Jessica Siegel, who is currently Associate Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at the university. Her research examines the long-term effects of methamphetamine exposure on the brain and behavior using a mouse model. She's currently exploring the effects of adolescent methamphetamine exposure on brain function and behavior, specifically examining the dopamine transporters in the brain. She's also interested in how drugs, such as nicotine, interact with the effects of methamphetamine in the adolescent brain. She teaches brain and human behavior and drugs and behavior in the psychology department and principles of neuroscience and neuropharmacology and the neuroscience program. Apparently, I don't get enough practice saying these scientific terms. She's also a passionate activist in the area of criminal justice. In fact, this summer, her and Professor Hodge wrote a really well-received article in the LA Progressive, which I'm sharing in the chat, on police murders and the war on drugs. My distinct pleasure tonight to introduce you to the phenomenal Dr. Jessica Siegel.
All right, thank you, Dr. Williams, and thank you for everyone coming, and thank you so much for the invitation to speak today. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about my work looking at the war on drugs specifically, and how the war on drugs has led to racial disparities within the criminal justice system and mass incarceration. And I have put together a PowerPoint, so I am going to share my screen because visuals are always helpful to lead you through this. All right, so I'm going to use the war on drugs as sort of our example here of one of the issues within the criminal justice system. I think certainly our issues of mass incarceration are not, isolated just to drug legislation. But what we've seen throughout history is that certainly the way in which the war on drugs was fought and implemented has really contributed to so many of the disparities that we see in the criminal justice system today, as well as to mass incarceration. When the war on drugs was implemented, a lot of people thought this was just a war to get rid of drug use in the United States. But when we look back at the history leading up to it and the way that it was implemented, again, we can see how this led to really a war on people and these really disparate impacts of the way that the war was implemented. So I'm going to start going way back, just a very brief history. It's important to understand this history as it leads into the war on drugs, because it really sets the stage for how the war on drugs played out. So we're going to go all the way back to 1865, starting with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished the formal institution of slavery. But within the text of the 13th Amendment was an exception for someone who had been convicted of criminal activity and who was being punished for a crime. So actually built into the 13th Amendment, we have this loophole where an individual can be really, quote, enslaved again, and their labor exploited if they are deemed to be a criminal and they are incarcerated. Following the Civil War, we saw that many states, especially in the South, enacted what were called black laws or black codes. And these were laws that ridiculous laws that were put onto the books, basically criminalizing all sorts of behaviors and regulating the behavior of African Americans. So for example, things like vagrancy laws, or an individual, an African American, had to have employment. And if they didn't, that was technically breaking these laws. So there were lots of efforts to criminalize people and put them into incarceration during this time using those codes or laws. And this was really the first time we actually saw a mass incarceration, a boom in incarceration of people of color in this country. Moving forward to the Jim Crow era, lots happening during this time. One main thing I want to point out that happened during the Jim Crow era is that there were great efforts to strengthen the stereotypical associations between African Americans and crime, and in particular drug crime. So I'll show you just one example of this. There are many, but this is one famous one. This was a newspaper article in the New York Times published in 1914 by an MD, a doctor, publishing that cocaine made African American men have superhuman strength. It made them impervious to bullets, and it made them better marksmen if they got their hands on a weapon. So obviously none of this is rooted in any sort of truth or science, but we had this situation here where the associations between Blackness and criminality, and especially drug criminality, were being solidified and formed. This was reinforced throughout the Jim Crow era and even moving into the Civil Rights Movement. So during the Civil Rights Movement, we saw a further strengthening of these stereotypical associations between African Americans and criminal activity and drug use. So many of the, for example, many of the peaceful protests and the demonstrations and civil disobedience that were the hallmarks of the Civil Rights Movement, many of those things were maybe technically breaking Jim Crow laws. So for example, like an African American sitting at a whites only lunch counter in a sit-in, that technically was breaking a Jim Crow law that said only Caucasians can sit at this lunch counter. So among some circles, political and social circles, that was taken advantage of even further. And these stereotypes and this linking between Black people and crime was kind of further solidified. There's a lot more we can say about this relationship and all this history here, but that kind of set the stage for what happened with the war on drugs and many of the stereotypes and preconceived notions about who was criminal and who was using drugs and how the war on drugs played out. So moving technically into what we consider the war on drugs, we can start here in 1971 with President Nixon. Nixon was the first president to actually identify drugs as something to have a war against. He declared drugs public enemy #1 and launched what he called an offensive against drugs of abuse. But it wasn't until the 80s with the Reagan administration that we got the official launching and kind of the coining of that term, war on drugs. So President Reagan declared the official war on drugs in 1982. And shortly thereafter, in 1986, we get the passage of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which was kind of the major legislation of the war on drugs. I'm going to come back to talking about this in a bit more detail in a moment. I want to point out here, though, that the war on drugs and what we think about as the war on drugs was not isolated to the 80s. It's something that spanned over decades, and it also is not isolated to one political party or the other. So some of the harshest legislation around drugs came from the Clinton administration in the 1994 federal crime bill. And within this bill, we had the 3 strikes and you're out mandate, which was a mandate that said with a 3rd drug felony conviction, an individual would spend the rest of their life in prison without the possibility of parole. So no chance of getting out, life in prison. These strikes could include, the 3 strikes could include nonviolent possession of drugs. Okay, so really a lot of punishment, sometimes for not a whole lot of crime. So again, this war on drugs spans political parties. It spanned over decades, and we have to really look at all of these different pieces to understand kind of how it all played out. With the implementation of the war on drugs, we got a lot of changes in the criminal justice system, including in policing and how police were asked to do their jobs. I want to point out two major changes that took place in policing with the initiation of the war on drugs. The first are called pretextual traffic stops. And these were, what a pretextual traffic stop means is that a police officer uses a minor traffic violation as a pretext to pulling over a car, really with the intention of trying to find drugs and weapons. And the idea here was that we were going to intercept, drug trafficking on the highways in this country. Pretextual traffic stop training occurred by the Drug Enforcement Agency. So the DEA, there was a program called Operation Pipeline that started in 1984. And with this, with Operation Pipeline, the DEA trained local police departments to do these kinds of pretextual traffic stops. Part of the reason I point this out is because explicit within the Operation Pipeline training was race of the driver. And so they actually trained and told police officers to be looking for Black and Latino male drivers primarily, and identifying those drivers as the ones that were likely to be trafficking drugs and thus pulling them over on these pretexts of a minor traffic violation to intercept the drugs. Okay, so we saw a pretty explicit racial element to who was being targeted in the traffic aspect of fighting the war on drugs. I also want to mention stop and frisk as a policy that existed before the war on drugs, but became more prevalent during the time that the war on drugs was implemented. So stop and frisk is when an officer can stop someone and frisk or kind of pat them down based on reasonable suspicion that a crime has occurred. And the idea there is that with this brief frisk, if the officer finds evidence that there might be a weapon or drugs or drug paraphernalia, that they can then do a full-blown search and get drugs and weapons off the streets. The issue with stop and frisk is that it was very racially discriminatory. So I'm showing you here just a screenshot from a decision that came down in the state of New York, looking specifically at the New York Police Department, so the NYPD. And the judge in New York actually deemed stop and frisk to be racially discriminatory and unconstitutional. And the reason for this comes from this quote taken from the text of this ruling, which said that in the studies that were done on this in more recent years, in 2011, 84% of the stops were Black and Latino, primarily men, and 88% of the people stopped were neither arrested nor received summonses. And less than 2% of these stops actually resulted in finding the drugs and the weapons. And so the problem with stop and frisk is not only was it not super effective in this case in keeping people safe on the streets, but it was also incredibly racially discriminatory and created a lot of tension between those who are being targeted and the police in these communities. Another major change that happened during the war on drugs was a real shift in the media focus on drugs. So we had all this legislative change and the changes in policing that was dictated from the higher ups in the DEA. But we also saw that the media really shifted how they were focusing on drugs. Prior to the 80s, there wasn't a whole lot of media attention on drugs. The American public didn't really identify drugs as something to be concerned about. That's what our public opinion polls showed us. But starting in the 80s with the war on drugs, we started to see a lot more media attention on drugs. And in particular, one drug, which is cocaine. So here I'm showing some examples of some time in Newsweek magazines over about a 10-year period, looking at, showing on the cover here, the focus on cocaine. There are two forms of cocaine. There's crack cocaine and there's powder cocaine. And the media representations of those two different forms of the drug were not equivalent. So if we look further here, if we look at the difference between crack and powder and the media focus, what we saw and what you still see in media representations of powder cocaine are images like this. So starting here, this is one of my favorite magazine covers. I mean, this Time magazine cover with the powder cocaine in this martini glass, it represents kind of wealth. It's fancy. There's an element of sophistication here. So this association between powder cocaine and wealth and richness, really. We often, this is just a stock photo that I found on Google, right? So powder cocaine is often associated with, white people. They're well-dressed, they've got champagne. We see white skin in these images. This is a picture from the movie Wolf of Wall Street, if you've seen that. But it sort of represents this point well that, there's a lot of wealth being represented and of course, whiteness being represented in these images. This media representation and the associations that were made for the general public here looked really different for powder cocaine compared to crack cocaine. So if we look at what we saw for crack cocaine, here are some of the kinds of images that come up with crack cocaine. Okay, so throughout the 80s and 90s, and even still today, we saw on the news and in newspapers and in media over and over again, African Americans being associated with this drug. And not only Black people, but impoverished Black people. So crack cocaine became very heavily associated with poor urban African Americans. Images like this, where his hands look kind of dirty, he's got a kind of rugged hat on, like this kind of imagery was shown to us over and over again. This is really important because it greatly shaped the way the general public thought about these two different drugs and the legislation that followed with the war on drugs. Another major media story that shaped the way the war on drugs ended up playing out is the story of Len Bias. So Len Bias was a very famous basketball star in the 80s. In 1986, he was the overall #2 NBA draft pick. He was drafted to the Boston Celtics, and the night of the draft, Len Bias unfortunately died of a overdose, of a cocaine overdose. And this story blew up. It was huge. Lots of people knew who he was. It was just a big sensational media story. The media, in many cases, erroneously reported that Len Bias died from a crack cocaine overdose, when in reality, he actually died from a powder cocaine overdose. But here we had this huge prominent story. And again, this association being made, in this case, incorrectly being made between a Black man and this drug, crack cocaine. The other important thing about Len Bias and this case, this happened in the summer of 1986. This case really motivated and pushed the 1986 legislation that followed. So that 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, politicians and the general public were going, we have to do something about this drug. It's a crisis. And what ended up happening is that this legislation was pushed through Congress, rushed through Congress. And I'm highlighting here in red some of this text. There were no hearings. There were no experts that came and informed Congress, about the pharmacology of drugs. There were no therapists or social workers or anybody kind of with their feet on the ground in this area, the criminal justice system. Congress was largely uninformed about how to pass good legislation here. And it was rushed through into law in order to be on the books by the November elections. Okay, and so that's a really important point of this. Again, this link between the media frenzy and the stereotypes propagated by the media, and then the legislation that ended up coming into law. So focusing a bit more on this 1986 legislation, this was a huge piece of legislation that again was signed into law by President Reagan. Some of the things to highlight from this, first of all, this is where we saw the enactment of restrictions on access to federal programs with a drug conviction. So things like federal education loans, federal housing, subsidized housing, food stamps, things of that nature were restricted with a drug conviction. We also saw the implementation of mandatory minimum sentences with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. And what this means is that a judge, if someone is convicted of a particular drug crime, the judge has to sentence at that mandatory minimum. They can't go below that. So it really tied the hands of judges in some cases who might have decided to sentence lower. They couldn't go below these mandatory minimums. And in many cases, these mandatory minimums were quite punitive. They were really harsh for the crime that was being committed. The other major thing that came with this legislation is what we call the 1 to 100 crack versus powder cocaine sentencing disparity. And so what this means is that, and I'll show you a graph of this, if you were caught with 5 grams of crack cocaine, that landed you with a 5-year mandatory minimum prison sentence, right? And that was for first-time offenders, nonviolent possession of the drug. Okay, so again, fairly harsh sentencing there. In order to get that same 5-year mandatory minimum, you would have to be caught with 100 times the weight of powder cocaine, so 500 grams of powder cocaine. This table is showing the same thing. In order to get a 10-year mandatory minimum, you had to have 50 grams of crack and then 100 times that, 5,000 grams or 5 kilos of powder cocaine. The problem with this legislation from a neuropharmacological perspective is that crack cocaine and powder cocaine are the same drug. Now, this was not common knowledge, and this is a place where perhaps Congress might have benefited from hearing from some people in this field about the drug and kind of what's going on in the body and the brain with this. So crack and powder are the same. The difference is, in order to get crack cocaine, what you do is you take the powder cocaine and you just add a basic substance like sodium bicarbonate or baking soda. You add water and you add heat, and that changes the form of the cocaine so that it can now be smoked, what are called crack rocks that can be smoked. Powder cocaine, on the other hand, can be either snorted up the nose or dissolved in liquid and injected intravenously. But once the drug is in the body, it's the same drug. Cocaine is cocaine. So in the brain, when we're thinking about the effects of the drug and the abuse potential and how behavior is changed, there is no difference between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And so again, this 1 to 100 sentencing disparity was not rooted in science. I mean, I can tell you that for 100%. Not rooted in good science. A lot of people were looking at this going, what is the reason behind this? And again, if we step back and look at this from a historical perspective, we can understand that in a lot of ways, the stereotypes of who was associated with each of these drugs play a large role in how this law ended up coming and being enacted. So the consequence of this change in legislation and the changes in policing and all of these things led to a change in how many people we incarcerate in this country. So what you're looking at here is a graph of the prison population in the United States from 1925 to 2014. And this is looking at the number of people who are incarcerated. And you can see, for the first few decades represented on this graph, we've been pretty stable in how many people have been incarcerated in the United States. Here's the 1982 line where the war on drugs was officially announced and started. And you can see a little bit before, but then certainly after that, we had this huge increase in the number of people that we incarcerate. And this is what we refer to as mass incarceration. This increase in the number of people incarcerated was largely due to the policies and the changes in the criminal justice system with the war on drugs. The consequence of this is that the United States now incarcerates more people per capita than any other nation in the entire world, which always, every time I say that, it still surprises me. I've said it a lot of times. But this image here is showing this data, a little bit old, but the data is still the same here. So looking at incarceration rate per capita, so for the number of people within the country, the United States is higher than every other nation. Of course, not all nations being represented here, but we incarcerate more of our population than any nation in the world. So when we look at the way that the war on drugs was implemented and how it played out, we see here that not all communities were being targeted and incarcerated the same way. But instead, we saw that communities of color, and especially poor communities of color, were especially hit hard by the war on drugs. So this is just data looking at a couple of demographic groups here. This is looking at specifically drug arrest rates per capita per 100,000 people for African Americans and Caucasian Americans before the war on drugs in 1980, and then a few years after the implementation in 1990. In that 10-year span, we saw a huge increase in the number of people and the percentage of people who were incarcerated. However, as you can see from these numbers, the percentage increase was far greater for African Americans, 363% increase in this 10-year period compared to 191 for the Caucasian group. The result of this is that by 1991, 1/4 or 25% of African American men were part of the criminal justice system, which is a staggering statistic to think about. So to show you some more data about, again, who is being targeted and what this actually looked like, I'll show you some data here. This is actually from 2003. So, you know, a little bit after what we think of as sort of the traditional war on drugs. But here, even in 2003, this image is showing you federal data looking at federal crack cocaine defendants. So individuals who have been arrested and coming into court for federal crack cocaine charges. And in the year 2003, African Americans made up over 80% of those who were coming in front of a judge for crack cocaine charges. The question here is, does this data reflect the use of the drug or the offending rates for the drug? And perhaps you're not shocked by this, but the answer is no, absolutely not. So here is some data looking at the use of crack cocaine. And what you can see here is that the majority of crack cocaine users are white. And for a lot of us who were like growing up in the 80s and 90s, or, you know, paying attention to the news at that time, that might seem surprising because that's not what we saw really being represented on the news and in media, and still isn't today. However, all of our data shows over and over again that white people use more crack cocaine than Black people. Here's some more data just to show this point. This is looking specifically at 18 to 25-year-olds. They're the age group that uses the most drugs, so they're often looked at. And this is looking at those who report have you ever used crack cocaine in 2002, 2006, and 2010. So a little bit more recent data. And as you can see here again, you know, if anything, white people are using and reporting the use of crack cocaine more than African Americans. These numbers are all very low for, you know, population data here. But if anything, again, Black people are using less than white people. So the use and the offending around crack cocaine cannot be used to justify that very disproportionate impact on who's being arrested and coming into the court system for crack cocaine charges. Now, I would like to be able to tell you here that this was isolated to the 80s and 90s and was isolated to cocaine and, you know, doesn't span to any other drugs, but unfortunately, I cannot tell you that. So we see that this disparity plays out in how other drugs are enforced, drug laws are enforced, and who is coming into the criminal justice system. So looking at a little bit more recent data, there's been a lot of attention more recently looking at marijuana possession and arrest rates for marijuana possession. So this is national data. So all the states combined and average there, looking at arrest rates for nonviolent possession of marijuana. Okay, so no weapons, no intent to sell, nothing else, just nonviolent possession of the drug. And this is looking 2001 to 2010. The pink bars here represent the arrest rate for white people per capita, and then the black bars for Black people per capita. And you can just see here the great disparity that exists in who is being arrested for marijuana possession. When you compile all the data, nationally speaking, for these years, African Americans were about 3.6, I think is the number, times more likely to be arrested for marijuana compared to whites. Now, the next graph I'm going to show you is the same data, same representation of the data, but instead of national data, it is for the state of Minnesota specifically. So here is what the Minnesota data looks like for the same years, 2001 to 2010. And as you can see, our disparity in this state is far greater even than the national disparity. Minnesota ranks as one of the worst, you know, places in the nation for the disparity between who is being arrested for marijuana possession. And when the data gets combined, we see that Black people in the state of Minnesota are nearly 8 times more likely than whites to be arrested for marijuana possession. And this was again from the years of 2001 to 2010. The more recent data shows that we're a little bit better. That disparity has gone down a bit, but we still are in the top of the nation in terms of the racial disparity of who is being targeted for marijuana possession. Now, once again, we can look at the data and ask, do the offending rates match that disparity in who is being arrested and brought into the criminal justice system? And again, just like we saw with crack, the answer is no. So here's just some data to show you, again, that 18 to 25 age range. We see that really African Americans and white Americans are using marijuana at basically the same rates. There's not a lot of difference here. But if anything, in these years that we're looking at, white people are using more than Black people. So once again, the amount of drug use and the offending rates cannot justify those pretty extreme disparities in who is being targeted and arrested for the drug. Unfortunately, some of these disparities, that we see, they don't begin and end with policing and the arrest rates. We see that there are disparities sort of throughout the criminal justice system. So I want to talk a moment here about prosecutors and plea bargains that were brought up a little bit earlier. The prosecutor has a lot of power in the courtroom to decide whether or not to bring charges to a case, and then also to decide what the plea bargain will be and what plea bargain will be offered. And as mentioned before, the vast majority of cases are settled at the federal level through plea bargains, which means that if the individual admits guilt, they can get a lesser sentence with their plea, versus if they go to trial, the risk is if they are convicted, their sentence would be much more harsher and potentially much longer. So there's a lot of incentive to go through plea, and the vast majority of cases are resolved through plea bargains. So that prosecutor has a lot of power. And when we look at who prosecutors are, this is data showing that 79% of prosecutors in the United States are white men, and less than 1% are women of color. So we lack representation and diversity within this really powerful position in our criminal justice system. There's also been data that's looked at how the disparities play out within pleas and sentencing. So I'm going to show you data specifically here from a study that was done in 2014, looking at the DA office in Manhattan. There was a huge study that was done, and the data comes from the year 2011. And what these researchers found is that compared to white defendants, Black defendants were 19% more likely to be offered pleas that included incarceration versus something like probation. They were 15% more likely than white defendants to be incarcerated for misdemeanor drug offenses, and 14% more likely to be incarcerated for felony drug offenses. Okay, so, and again, this is controlling for the type of crime and the severity and criminal background. All those things being equal, we see that Black defendants are getting these harsher sentences and more likely to be incarcerated compared to similarly situated white defendants. Now, the interesting thing about this is that people know what's going on. This is some data that comes out of the United States Sentencing Commission, which is a federal committee, basically nonpartisan committee that looks at sentencing guidelines and makes recommendations to Congress and does research on this. And this is published in 2017. Their most recent research on this found that Black male offenders continue to receive these very long sentences. So their sentences compared to white defendants are 19.1% longer, again, for the same types of crime and the same criminal background. Now, this data is for a variety of different kinds of crime, not specifically just for drugs. I think another really important piece of this is that the violence and the criminal history for that individual cannot account for this racial disparity. So they controlled for in the study and looking at this data, things like criminal background, how much violence was in the different crimes potentially, and they, all things being equal, still found that Black men were given these much longer sentences compared to white men. When I pull out just the drug data from this finding here, what that data showed is that between the years 2012 and 16 for drug trafficking, Black male drug offenders received sentences that were 17.7% longer than white male drug offenders. That's for the same offense, the same drug, same amount of criminal background, all things being equal. Okay, so again, we see these racial disparities playing out at all of these different levels of the criminal justice system. So part of the issue with this is not only the disparity in who is being associated with drugs and targeted and brought into the system, but the other piece of the problem here is that there are long-lasting consequences in these drug-related convictions. So there are lots of limitations that are put on a person once they have that drug conviction, including, this is not a comprehensive list, but some of the important things here: access to education loans from the federal government, right? If someone wants to go to school, that becomes really difficult. They don't have access to that. Access to good employment, right? Getting a job becomes very challenging. Employers can discriminate based on criminal background if they do a background check, or if they require someone check that box on an application. Access to housing, things like public housing or Section 8 housing, becomes severely restricted with a drug-related felony. And then also landlords, private landlords can discriminate with a background check based on that criminal conviction. And then finally, and very importantly, voting rights are infringed upon with a drug-related conviction. It does depend on what state you are in, what this looks like. In the state of Minnesota, I believe that you have to be what's called off paper, which means not on probation or parole, so done with your sentence in order to get your voting rights restored. And that can be a long time for some people, so long after they're actually released from prison. So we see not only does this affect the individual, but this starts to affect entire communities based on who has been targeted and the high percentage of individuals who have gone through this system and then are losing access to some of these very important things. All right, so I always feel like it's such a bummer to end on something like that. So I like to end with just some suggestions and ideas that I come up with about like what can we do about this? Is all hope lost, or are there ways that we can think about reforming this system? There have been legislative reforms in recent years and lots more discussion, I think, about some of these things. Some of my suggestions at the individual level include things like challenging your biases about drugs, right? Not everything you hear about drugs on social media is true. So do your research, understand drugs and substance use disorder, and challenge those biases. Same thing for people who have a criminal conviction. Challenge your biases about formerly incarcerated individuals. Advocate for changes in legislation, sentencing guidelines. Of course, our voting is one way that we can do this, putting people in power who are going to be able to implement this change, but we can also advocate for that in many other ways. Understand the impacts of incarceration, right? And that there are long-lasting difficulties that come with that. And if we think about wanting a society that works better for everyone, I think we need to think really critically about how we can do that for formerly incarcerated individuals who are trying to re-enter into society. And finally, and perhaps this is a nice segue into our next conversation here, and I don't have to tell all of you because you are here, but get involved, right? There's community efforts, re-entry programs, restorative justice programs. We as citizens can work together to also start to change the system and support those who are coming out of it, and hopefully prevent some people from going into it in the first place. So getting involved in these programs, I think, is one of my strongest recommendations. And with that, I will say thank you, turn it back over to our organizers and our next speaker.
Jessica, thank you. We appreciate it. That's a great segue, by the way. Thank you. We didn't even plan that. Thank you. There's a lively chat about a couple resources going on as well, so you might want to take a peek at that while we hear from Brenda in just a moment. So thank you for everyone for that lively chat about the new Jim Crow book and some resources that we'll add to it. So nice job, everyone. I'm going to toss it over to Randy to introduce our next speaker, Miss Brenda.
It is my great pleasure to introduce Brenda Burnside. And I have to start by saying Brenda was my trainer and my son Isaac's trainer when we were fortunate enough to go through circle training. Brenda's work is amazing. Isaac is working in his first circle now. And I'll say that the training has even changed how we interact with each other as a family, all for the better. Brenda is the founder of and CEO of Let's Circle Up Restorative Services, LLC. She has previously served as the Restorative Practices Coordinator at the Dispute Resolution Center in St. Paul, a local nonprofit organization and the oldest mediation organization in the state of Minnesota. Prior to her work at DRC, Brenda worked as an outreach director at Educators for Excellence, where she was instrumental in organizing teachers to use their voices and tell their stories to make changes in education for more equitable outcomes for students and families. Brenda is a graduate of the University of Minnesota and has 12 years experience working in the Roseville area school district with special education student scholars. Brenda is the president of Conflict Resolution Minnesota's Twin Cities chapter and is a contributing member of Reimagining Justice for Youth in Ramsey County. She's also an active member of the Gamma Tau chapter of Iota Phi Lambda Sorority Incorporated, where she serves as vice president. She is a skilled educator, trainer, circle keeper, and restorative practitioner, and she resides in St. Paul with her 2 adult children. Welcome, Brenda.
Thank you so much, Randy. I appreciate that. And thank you, Jessica, for the segue into what can we do? The whole issue of mass incarceration. How can we actually do something about that? I'll start by saying that there is a mindset that has created our system of mass incarceration. And it's also a mindset that perpetuates it. And I guess that's the start of what we can do. A couple of the suggestions that Jessica offered us in her last slide presentation was to challenge our own biases. And I'm going to add to that, to challenge our own mindsets. We find that our historical perspective is usually formulated by the history of the things that we have gone through as a country. And as such, we have adopted punishment as a deterrent for behavior or crime in this case. So I would challenge each of us to look at our mindset. I think when we look at restorative practices, it allows us to sit down with each other and to have conversations and to tell our stories about how we got to this place. And when we sit down and tell those stories, we seek to find the humanity in each of us. There are many people who I sit down with who think differently. And as such, they feel like we have like this desert island for people who don't agree with us. Well, there is no such place. So we have to deal with each other and what we have. And I will tell you, there is no substitution for human interaction. When we sit down and have those conversations and we tell those stories and we listen with empathy and we listen for understanding and we listen without judgment, there is just a transformation that happens across that circle. I will say also that circle is an indigenous process where we simply sit down and we seek to get the story. We look for the humanity. I never thought I would have to teach human beings how to be human, but it seems that we've forgotten or we've gotten too busy to notice that there is a person behind every action. There is a communication in every behavior, and we don't look for that person. We only look at the action and then we react. So I would challenge us each to look at our mindsets, to be more restorative. One of the things that we do examine in the training that we're going to be doing is we're going to look at our language. Even the words we use criminalize and judge people. So we're going to look at how we use harming words, how we can use healing words, just how we can look from to change our behavior, to shift from crime and punishment to harm and needs, and to look at what is the need behind the action or the behavior that people are, those different actions that they're doing, and how can we help so that they don't fall into some of the actions and behaviors. The other thing that we'll actually be looking at in the training, we'll also look at the elements of circle, how we sit and talk to each other, how we think of each other. And I think Jessica was very good at outlining how we think of each other just historically, and why those pictures have been created in our mind that punishment is the only way to change a behavior. And it's so funny because I think of some of my students, and I remember how we used to try to get students to comply to certain kinds of behavior. And I thought to myself, I don't know if you've ever heard the quote, but the quote that says, a man convinced against his will is of the same opinion still. So we get a compliance for 5 minutes, and then later on, because they are not, convinced, when they get an opportunity again, the same behavior persists. So I think about my students. I think about the interactions that I've had in the community, and I've had opportunities to sit down where people have had cases, and they have gone all the way through our judicial process, and no one stopped to get their story. Nobody asked the question, what happened? Why did you react the way that you did? And what was your mindset when this actually took place? And I get to do that on the back end to hear the stories of people. I've even walked through the process, through our judicial process, with some people who had to go to court. And I was looking for an opportunity for that person to be able to tell their story of what really happened behind the crime they were charged with. There was not, I went through a 2-hour process with someone, and it wasn't until the last 15 minutes that they were asked a question. They actually watched a video of what the court proceedings would be. They sat down and listened to some cases. When their case came up, the attorneys spoke. The person never spoke until the last 15 minutes of that 2-hour interaction, when they were pulled into a room and asked if they wanted to do a diversion program. Well, in the middle of that process, if we had asked somebody what the story was, we might have found out that the action was not anything that would be chargeable. But we never asked that question. And as a result, we've had a person who's gone all the way through the judicial system, has been charged, and now is labeled as a criminal, so to speak. And we never even heard the story. So this process of restorative practices actually gives us an opportunity to sit down, to talk to the person, to find out what happened. What was the story? There's always a story behind it, and to see the humanity in the person before actually charging with the crime. Now, if you ask me, does this mean we will never incarcerate anyone? It doesn't mean that. There are some instances where people are a harm to themselves. And in those cases, people may need some time to reconsider some things. However, a majority of the cases that I have seen come to us in circle, it's not anything that would be considered a criminal behavior that anyone could not overcome just by sitting in a circle or by being accountable to the communities that they belong to. I will also add that accountability and punishment do not correlate. So many times we think accountability always means punishment. It does not. It does not. You can have accountability without punishment. We require punishment because it's our mindset. So I just want to encourage you that restorative practices, they do work. When we sit down and talk to each other, we can change things. We can be restorative in our approach. And I think our young people are really worthy of us looking at a different way of doing justice in our system. And I would love to entertain any questions that you may have. And I'm not sure the format that we have for that. But I think that's all I have about the restorative process.
Brenda, can I give out some details?
Sure.
So we're doing a 4-week session beginning January 5th, 2021. Let's just all take a moment for 2021. We're just going to hold it. We're going to hold it and make sure it's great. It's Tuesday evenings, 5:30 to 7:30 on Zoom. 4. I said 4, didn't. Okay. It's been a long day. Registering, if you want to email me, I've been collecting the registrations for Brenda and us. There's no charge for the training. You'll be part of this training process, and we're asking that you commit to 2 circles. Brenda, how long? Can you give us an average circle? Is it 1 meeting, 2 meetings, maybe?
Now, we normally have a 2-hour circle. And in that time, we talk about what happened in the stories. And then after that, we ask that people will sit in circle, 2 circles, just volunteer for 2 circles. And in those circles, they will get some experience with what it means to actually sit in circle. And then at that point, it becomes a practice. So at the close of the classes, in the 4 classes that we're going to have in January, you will leave with a portfolio, and that portfolio will help you to practice. So that's why we use the word of restorative practices. We keep doing it. We continue to have circles. We use them in our families and our communities. So when you think after 4 weeks, I got it, you don't got it. After 4 weeks, what you have is tools to move forward with practicing. I have done hundreds of circles, and I think that's where your experience comes from. By sitting in circle, and the interactions and the hours that you spend in circle and talking to community is where you gain that experience.
And one quick question was, we're going to start working more with adolescents and juveniles through Ramsey County, right?
Yes.
Okay. And then another question that came from Bill, what does the typical circle, how many people?
Normally it's 5 to 7.
Okay.
And in some cases, people will bring people to circle with them to support them. I do this work in the school system, as well as in the justice system, as well as in the community. So sometimes the circles will get up to, maybe 7 to 10. We usually try to do no more than 10 in one circle.
Yeah. And so if the juvenile might have a social worker or a trusted adult, they would want them in that circle with them, correct?
Yes, a probation officer, in some cases, the family or a family member. Yeah.
And currently we're doing mostly online, Zoom, COVID safe, or a combination of both right now?
Well, they are usually online. Sometimes people specifically ask for in-person, in which case we do social distancing.
Okay. Yep. So it's preference a little bit right now. You do not have to be a Ramsey County resident to participate. We will welcome folks from Minneapolis. We like everyone.
We do try to match you with people who are in the communities that you live in.
Yep. So Hennepin County folks, if you want to go through the training, we will welcome you, and maybe Brenda and I can work with you to get put into circle trainings with some folks over on that side of the river as well. And so I'm just reading through the questions as they're coming through chat too with you. So
Brenda, could you talk a little bit about how big the time commitment is for a volunteer to do 2 circles once the trainings are complete? And maybe talk also about how much homework there is during the 4 training sessions.
I heard about this homework. I'm doing the training in January, so I'm a little worried.
Well, you know what? It's fun homework, and it's not a huge time commitment, but it is a lot of thought work, right? So, so that's where the time comes in. What the circle homework would look like. Let's talk about the homework first. There are 2 books that I recommend for the session, and they are the Little Book of Restorative Practices, Restorative Justice by Fania Davis, and the Little Book of Circle Process by Kay Pranis. And those are very minimal books, under 100 pages. And in those books, you might have to read that for a session. We also do some writing, and we put together a portfolio. And that portfolio consists of 7 to 10 items that you walk away with. And you will be putting that together as the class progresses. So we'll do a little bit of that each session. And at the end of the session, you will have that portfolio to leave with. After that happens, actually sitting in circle, what it looks like is this. We have someone who has caused harm who comes to our circle, and we might ask them first, we'll suspend the talking piece, and we'll just have an opening, right? Where we're sitting down just to talk, to, gather ourselves and to come together. and we ask them just to tell us what happened. You know, how did this take place? What mindset were you in? You know, that kind of thing. Tell us anything you want to share about what happened that day. They might share their story, and we will go around the circle and we'll talk about the impact that might have on our communities. We might suggest things to them that would repair the harm in the community. We might also talk about just, you know, whatever things that the person may want to discuss. What are your needs? What do you need from us in order to help you to be successful? Information, is it being connected to someone? And particularly what I like to do is connect everyone before they leave Circle, connect them to a community agency or organization where they can ask questions. In many cases, people just don't know what to do, right? So when they have a need, they're not sure where to turn or where to go to. And as a result, you see these behaviors acting out. So that's kind of what the circle looks like. After we do those things, we usually come up with some different suggestions for the person to actually repair harm in the community and to become connected. We believe particularly that people do not burn down communities that they feel connected to, right? Or they don't cause harm in communities that they feel connected to or possession of. So those are the kind of connections we try to make. You know, we try to build relationships there. So I think that answers a little bit of the question of what happens in Circle, what kind of homework there would be. And a lot of the homework is really examining some of our own biases and thinking that has gotten us to a place where we think of people not as human beings, but as objects to be punished.
Brenda, you actually hit a bunch of the questions. What happens at the end, the recommendations to repair the harm. So what I'm going to do, we've got to move on to our interfaith text study with the time we have left with Professor Earl Schwartz here in just a moment. I'm going to take all of these questions in the chat, combine them, and I'll send them to Brenda, and she and I will go back and forth and make sure we answered all of them. And we'll get that out to you folks. Again, as I've been sitting here, Brenda, I've gotten like 4 or 5 emails with people who are interested. So you and I will touch base and we'll get everyone set to begin January 5th. We'll do more of these trainings if the need is out there, the desire is out there, because we've heard Tuesday night's not great for some folks. But we will continue to do this as we are able to continue the partnership between Let's Circle Up, Interfaith Action, and Ramsey County Attorney John Choi's office. So Brenda, thank you for taking time to be with us. We love to get this cohort up and going through Opportunity St. Paul, and we just thank you for the work you've done.